things that we have written in the Church of God decades ago that now have come to pass or are coming to pass. And I would like to take the opportunity today to talk about some of those and remind us of where we were, what we've said, and what has since happened. And so the title of my sermonette is Europe and Brexit. And I want to thank Dr. Ryan McNeely for only mentioning it in passing last week, because I thought he was going to steal that since he is such a student of history, and that's such an interesting thing for him. But he didn't, so I'm glad for that. So I would like to go through 5 different things that we have said as a church, mainly written by that one man, Mr. Herbert Armstrong, but other authors in the church, and see how they stand up. First thing that was said was that Europe would unite. Europe would unite. We wrote, "The soon-coming resurrected Holy Roman Empire, a sort of soon-coming United States of Europe, a union of 10 nations will rise up out of or following the common market of today." And sure enough, that happened. We wrote that in Mystery of the Ages in 1985, but we had been writing about that decades earlier. In fact, we wrote about it so far back when they didn't even have any kind of union, when it was just individual nations. And then after a while, they formed a trading bloc, kind of like NAFTA is today, so they could trade food with each other without any tariffs. But it was not what we would call the United States of Europe. And now, though, if you look over there, if you look at the EU, they have a European Parliament, they have European laws, a European Court of Justice, a European Constitution. So truly, some of the things that were said have actually come to pass. They're even working on a European army. Another thing that was said back then, going back even further to the 50s, 1956, was that the Germans would lead and dominate that Europe. We wrote, "The Germans are coming back from destruction of World War II." We also wrote, "Probably Germany will lead and dominate the coming United States of Europe." So it might seem obvious now, because, Germans, they're good engineers, they're good at trade, and so, yeah, it makes sense that they'd be at the top, but that was not obvious when we wrote that. When we wrote that, Germany was a divided country. When we wrote that, Germany was on food aid. They couldn't even feed their country. In fact, Germany was in ruins when that was written. I want to quote from a Wikipedia article on the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was the American plan of food aid, where America provided food for Germany and other European nations so that they wouldn't starve. But look what it says about Germany. In Germany, housing and food conditions were very bad, as the disruption of transport, markets, and finances slow to return to normality. In the West, bombing had destroyed 5 million homes and apartments. 12 million refugees from the East had crowded in. Nobody wanted to be in the Russian-controlled area, so refugees came to the West. Many more refugees than are coming there now. Food production was only 2/3 of the pre-war level, while normal meat and grain shipments no longer arrived from the East. Even while the Marshall Plan was being implemented, the dismantling of German industry continued. Support for dismantling by this time was predominantly coming from the French. So, in other words, all the factories that had not been bombed during the war were being systematically disassembled and shipped out to other Allied countries because they wanted to make sure that the Germans didn't rise again. The Allied Control Council set the foundation of the future German economy by putting a cap on German steel production. The maximum allowed was set at about 5.8 million tons of steel per year, equivalent to 25% of the pre-war production level. Germany was to be reduced to the standard of living it had known at the height of the Great Depression. Consequently, car production was set to 10% of pre-war levels. So that was Germany as it existed when that statement was made. When Mr. Armstrong said they would lead Europe, that was the condition that they were in. So it's a very improbable statement. It wasn't just something that was a foregone conclusion or that it was common sense. It was a very improbable statement, probably a statement that people would have laughed at. But he said not only would they recover, but they would be the leaders of that united Europe. A third statement that we made, and I say we because we are the churches of God, that is our affiliation, we're a descendant of that group, is Brexit. We called the Brexit. Europe would have no part of it, speaking of that united Europe. We also said, in that first quote that I read about the united Europe coming, I stopped one sentence short because I wanted to save it for this point, and that sentence was, Britain will not be in that empire soon to come. So we had the vote 9 days ago, and the votes were being counted, and before the results were on Drudge, before they were on Fox News, even before they were on the BBC, we said what would happen. And why did we say that Britain, of all countries, would leave? Why didn't we say Poland would leave? Why didn't we say Italy would leave? Well, there were reasons for that. And students of the Bible and students of prophecy can come to that conclusion. There are reasons why that was written. The fourth statement that was made is that Russia would lose its Eastern European satellite countries. Now, as you recall, the world was divided into two superpowers. There was the U.S. and the free world on the one hand, and there was the Soviet Union and the communist world behind the Iron Curtain on the other hand. And if you would ask a lot of people which side was winning, a lot of people weren't so sure that America was winning because country after country was falling to communism. There was a paranoia in America that even America was being taken over by communists, right? We had the McCarthyism where we just thought it was taking over everywhere. And yet, we did not get on that bandwagon when we wrote what we wrote, when we wrote our magazines and things like that. On the contrary, we said, no, they're not only not going to grow, communism won't continue on the march, it's going to shrink. Some of those Eastern European countries are going to break away and be part of that united Europe. And truly, that was an absurd statement that we made. And yet, here we are. Many of the countries that are now part of the EU used to be Russian satellite countries. The fifth statement that we made in our literature is the prophecy reveals no military war between Russia and our democratic nations. That also was published in 1956. And again, when you think of how the world was back then, not everybody here was around back then, but we all know or should know from history how that was. People were scared of dying in a nuclear war. There were two superpowers. They hated each other, and they both had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. People were building fallout shelters in their basements. We had scares like the Cuban Missile Crisis where things seemed to be right on the verge of going up and a war breaking out. We had scientists who got together and made a doomsday clock. And every time some geopolitical event occurred, they would set the doomsday clock a little bit closer to midnight, where midnight indicated the time when the world would end in nuclear war between Russia and America. That was part of everybody's consciousness. It was part of everybody's culture. And yet we said, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. And sure enough, it didn't happen. In fact, we said the world won't end this way. The world won't end this way. We knew that. Now, that was written in 1982. And an interesting piece of trivia, most of the booklets, if you look at them, they have no author listed, or they have Herbert W. Armstrong as the author. That particular booklet, if you open it up, Mr. Armstrong is there as the second author. The first author's name is Michael Snyder. I thought that was interesting when I was doing my research. So, how did we know all these things. Mr. Armstrong said, I'm not a prophet. He actually said, I'll read this, emphatically, I am not a prophet, in the sense of one to whom God speaks directly, revealing personally a future event to happen, or new truth, or new or special instruction from God, separate from and apart from what is contained in the Bible. And I never claimed to be. So he's not a prophet, and yet he called all of these things. How's that possible? He said that in 1972. Well, he's not a prophet, but he is a student of prophecy. He did not claim to have God talking to him and personally explaining things to him. He was not like Paul, who Christ came and talked to him in the wilderness or anything and read knowledge. He is a student of prophecy. But even then, there are lots of students of prophecy, a lot of people who read these things, and a lot of churches come to all sorts of crazy conclusions. So how did he know all these things? Well, wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. Proverbs 9:10. And I would say also that wisdom begins with obeying the Lord, with keeping his commandments. If you think about what you know, what do? We keep the commandments. We keep the Sabbath, we keep the holy days, and we have an understanding of God's plan because we do that. It's not just an academic exercise when we read what Paul says in Corinthians when he says Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. It's not just an academic exercise when we read about Pentecost and the Holy Spirit and each step in the plan of salvation. And the reason it's not an academic exercise is because we live it. We're experienced with it. And so when we see it in the Bible, we recognize it. It's not a foreign thing to us. If you didn't do those things, it would be foreign to you, and you would just gloss over that as some old artifact. It wouldn't mean anything to you. And so if you're grounded, and if you have the Holy Spirit, and you read things, prophecies, you're going to have a different frame of mind than someone else who doesn't have that same grounding in God's Word. And so he was a student of prophecy. He kept the commandments. He understood God's plan. And he ridded himself, just as we do, of other concepts, other days that come from paganism. Get rid of all that baggage so you can see clearly and let the Bible interpret itself. So it really is amazing all the things that were said correctly. The one thing that I would say that he maybe didn't get so well is the timing. We always thought that things were right around the corner. In fact, several of the quotes come from an article called 1975 in Prophecy. And that was written in 1956. There were a lot of articles in the 50s that wrote about the 70s or wrote about the 80s, not from our church, but from Reader's Digest or others, that said, look at all this wonderful technology we have. We're going to be flying around in spaceships. We're all going to be working 20-hour weeks and teleporting places. All the things that people said, because science is the solution, right? And so the title of our article was kind of a counterpoint to that, where we said, yes, science is doing all these amazing things, but society is not going to be dominated by how our technology advances. Society is going to be dominated by what spiritually goes on in the world and what God said would go on in the world. So with our booklet, we're drawing a contrast to the secular view of how things would play out. So we had our timing wrong, but it was quite impressive, I think, the things that we said. So that particular student of prophecy, I think he did a pretty good job. If you look at where Europe is now compared to where it was then, if you look at those Eastern European countries, how they're free now, if you look at Germany that rose up from the ashes and is in its place now with Angela Merkel calling a lot of the shots there. If you look at Britain having freshly left 9 days ago, or declared its desire to leave. And if you look at Russia, a shadow of its former self, it throws a lot of tantrums, but it's not the superpower that it was. And we said those things. It's an amazing thing. So I wish I had time to go in with each of those 5 things and say, how on earth did we look in here and draw all those conclusions? Because it really is a fascinating thing how those puzzle pieces are all identified and then connected together. But this is a sermonette, so that is not going to happen. But you can go into details. There are some booklets that you can read. We have 2 in particular. The U.S. and Britain in Bible Prophecy is the booklet that helps identify where is Israel. If you don't know who Israel is, you can't really understand much about prophecy, because the Bible is pretty much an Israel-centric book when it goes through the prophecies. We also have a book of Revelation Unveiled. And if you want to know about Europe and the history and what is the connection with Europe and that statue, remember, with the head of gold down to the feet of iron and clay, why do we associate that with Europe? Well, we have good reasons why we do that. And we wrote some things about it so that you can go through the Bible and see how is it that you can make that connection. And another set of books that are also very interesting, at least the one on the left, this is one not from the church. This is one written over 100 years ago now, called Judah's Scepter and Joseph's Birthright. It's way thicker than our booklet. It's a couple hundred pages. And it's a fascinating look going through the Bible at how you prove where Israel is and where it wanted to and how it got to where it is now and who they are. And it could even be that a lot of what we understand, or some of it at least, comes from that book. And that book is so old that the copyright has expired and anybody can just get the content now freely on the internet. And of course, I have the Bible on here. Booklets are great for taking a particular subject. The Bible has a habit of putting one subject here a little, there a little, and it's all over the place. And booklets do a great job of conglomerating it all into one spot, to identifying it. But there's no substitute to go to the actual source. So it really is amazing what we've understood, the crazy things, seemingly crazy things that we've said, and what all has come to pass. And now, 9 days from Brexit is a good time to think about all those things. Prophecy is an affirmation that the Bible is true, because really what was written wasn't written 60 years ago. It was written 2,000, 3,000 years ago. God knew all these things that are going to happen. And that's a proof of the Bible. That's one way, if we're not sure, if we're on the fence about evolution or about something else, we have this thing that God put in there, all these things that, lo and behold, look at where the world is compared to where we said it is. And our understanding, the things that we wrote 60 years ago that were based on what was written 2,000, 3,000 years ago, that's also an affirmation. God is working with His people. He's working with His saints. He's revealed His way to us. He's called us out of the world, called us out of paganism, out of darkness. He's shown us His way, and He's also given us insight into some parts of the Bible that are otherwise very obscure parts, very hard to understand. So God truly does declare the end from the beginning, and it's exciting to see it happening.